Welcome to episode 311 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Jerry Hester, who served in the FBI for 20 years. In this episode, he reviews his Paesan Blues investigation, an FBI undercover operation that exposed Italian mafioso Roberto Settineri's global crime network with the collaboration of the Italian National Police and, surprisingly, the cooperation of Ponzi schemer Scott Rothstein. The Miami United States Attorney's Office honored Jerry with an Outstanding Law Enforcement Officer of the Year award for his work on the Paesan Blues investigation. After the case review, we discuss Jerry's new book, Miami Mafia, FBI Politics and How an Investigation Was Nearly Sabotaged. The book is focused on Operation Paesan Blues and the investigation of Settineri, but it also describes how and why Jerry believes the FBI internal agency politics and conflicting agendas affected the investigation. During his bureau career, Jerry was assigned to the San Francisco and Miami FBI field offices, conducting criminal investigations into matters involving organized crime, narcotics, public corruption, and counterterrorism. He gained extensive experience in working joint international investigations with foreign government officials. Before his retirement, he managed the Miami FBI's confidential human source program. Currently, Jerry is an integrity representative with the NFL, National Football League, in their security department, conducting and overseeing game day security for players and referees, and monitoring compliance with NFL policy as it relates to the legalized sports betting industry. Now, before we get to the case review, I want to provide an information alert for those interested in an internship with the FBI. The FBI has changed the application period for the summer 2025 honors internship program. And yes, I said 2025. If you're interested in an internship with the FBI for summer 2024, it's way too late. But there's still a little bit of time for you to apply for 2025 between now and March 1st. So you only have a little more than a week to go. The FBI's honors internship program is for undergraduate students between their junior and senior years in college, as well as graduate students pursuing a master's degree, JD, or PhD. You can learn more at fbijobs.gov. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find links to where you can join my reader team to keep up with the FBI and books, TV, and movies, buy me a cup of coffee, and learn more about me and my nonfiction book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, and my 2 FBI crime novels, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers, available as ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and as audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Jerry Hester. Hey, Jerry, how are you?
Very good. Thank you for having me.
Well, I have spent the last few days reading your new book, Mafia Miami, FBI Politics and How an Investigation Was Nearly Sabotaged. And it was absolutely, I guess the word I had to say is thought-provoking and memory-provoking, because some of the things that you talk about in the book happened to me during my career, which was working white-collar crimes. There were many times that I was nodding my head and agreeing with some of your observations and assessments. But today, we are going to concentrate on the investigation itself. Where do you want to start?
I'd just like to start with how it all came about and about what the investigation is named and everything. Let's just start with my book, Mafia Miami, FBI Politics and How an Investigation Was Nearly Sabotaged, is about Operation Paesan Blues, which was a long-term international FBI undercover investigation that I led out of the Miami FBI division beginning in late 2006. It lasted for 3.5 years until 2010. The targets of the investigation were members of a Sicilian mafia organization, primarily operating out of the Miami and Miami Beach area, who were suspected of being involved in drug trafficking, money laundering, extortion, and other various criminal activities. This criminal enterprise stretched from South Florida to New York and to Italy. Throughout the book, as you alluded to, I also discuss and analyze the numerous operational and administrative obstacles that I encountered during the investigation. Some of those challenges were the result of FBI policy and cultural changes that were occurring around that time. But for now, I don't want to focus too much here on those administrative challenges. I think that would take away from the meat and potatoes of the investigation, so to speak, and how it all came about.
When we think about organized crime, Italian American organized crime, I think about, of course, The Sopranos and the observations that I'm aware of and have heard from agents who've worked this particular violation, that there really is, not a deep connection to Italy, and that many of the main members don't even speak Italian. But your particular investigation involved people that did have a direct connection to Italy.
That is correct. One of the unique things that we saw in this investigation was the fact that ours were Sicilian mafia, actually from Sicily, but they were also connected to some of the New York families, which is not something that you saw a lot of at that time. Generally, they were with one or the other and didn't commingle a whole lot. But in this investigation, we discovered they did quite a bit. As I said, I'm just going to focus on that, on the investigation and how Paesan Blues began, how it progressed, the twists and turns, the ups and downs, and how we were ultimately successful.
Where did the name Paesan Blue come from?
Very good question. And I was actually kind of hoping you would ask that. This was an undercover operation. And Jerry, as you know, the FBI undercover operations, you have to have a code name, and it has to be 2 words. It sounds simple, right? But it can be very difficult a lot of times because the FBI has been around for 100 years. A lot of code names, good code names, are used. So you have to come up with a code name before you can even get authorization to work an undercover investigation. I racked my brains over this, and basically I come up with Paesan Blues because Italian paesano, and these paisanos are going to have the blues after the investigation is over. At least that's what we hoped at the time when I created the name. That's how Paesan Blues, the name, how I came up with that. I decided to write a book on the Paesan Blues investigation primarily because when I was working this case, due to the very entertaining and charismatic subjects involved, it sometimes felt like I was working from a typical Hollywood movie script. The main subject alluded to earlier was a Sicilian by the name of Roberto Settineri. Settineri was a high-priority Italian mafia who had been on the radar of the INP, which is the Italian National Police, for several years. Settineri, I soon discovered, was actually living and operating in the greater Miami area. And the INP soon was able to provide tons of intelligence and information, proving that Settineri had many connections to the highest levels of organized crime groups in all of Italy. Talking about The Sopranos, Settineri reminded me of a real-life Tony Soprano. He kind of looked like him, tough-looking guy, brooding character, very serious and reserved, but he was also very intelligent. And many of the other mafia subjects involved in the case, associates of Settineri, they also seemed like characters that you would read about in a fiction novel. For example, Settineri's closest associate was a guy by the name of Antonio Tracamo, who was also a Sicilian national living in the Miami area. Tracamo was Settineri's right-hand man, and he looked the part too, always well-dressed in designer clothes, dark sunglasses, much like Settineri. Except Tricamo, he had a smoothly shaven bald head on top of his bodybuilder type physique. We quickly determined that he was Settineri's enforcer. For those of you that's not familiar with the term enforcer is the individual in the mafia organization who keeps order, discipline, and beats people up or worse for the group. That was Tricamo. He was like a bodyguard to Settineri. And at that time, Settineri and Tricamo, they were inseparable. Ironically enough, Tricamo was the polar opposite of Settineri, who was, as I said, reserved and serious. But Tricamo, he was gregarious and outgoing, and he always had this confident swagger about himself. You might even say that he was cocky. He was cocky. Settineri was also on speed dial at that time with many other well-known mafia players in Miami. People like Bobby Era, Frankie the Hat DiStefano. These guys were both old-time and well-known mafia members who began in New York and were now living and operating in South Florida. In New York, Settineri, he was directly connected to individuals like Jackie the Nose D'Amico. What a name, huh? He was, at that time, the underboss of the Gambino family. And another interesting character, Gaetano Napoli, who was a capo, which is a captain, basically, with the Gambino family out of New York. The investigation started in late 2006 and went for 3.5 years. From the very beginning, it was apparent that Paesan Blues was an organized crime investigation that had a lot of promise with these high-profile targets. But as we soon discovered, it would also prove to be very challenging. When you add all of that up, that combination, what it really means is that there's a very low chance of success, at least initially when we started the investigation. High priority, high level targets makes it difficult. Mainly, we knew it was going to be challenging and difficult because I didn't have a source, also known as an informant. I use that term interchangeably, source, informant. I did have a source in the investigation initially when I started, and Jerry knows this as well, that any FBI agent will tell you that is not the ideal way to begin an investigation. Most successful FBI cases start out with the source, someone who comes forward with information about your bad guy. This gives you direction in starting the investigation to come up with a plan in which to hopefully move your case forward.
I think one of the things that I'd like to kind of establish is why you got this particular person. I'm sure there's a lot of organized crime figures in Miami. What's the rest of the squad doing, and how was it that you get assigned this particular person to investigate?
Yeah, good question. At the time when I started this investigation, I had just recently been transferred over from a counterterrorism squad to an organized crime squad, which was what I had wanted to work and investigate with the FBI. That was where my interest lied. As soon as I got to the squad, apparently the INP, the Italian National Police, had notified FBI Miami of Roberto Settineri, who was living and operating right in our backyard, and we were not aware of it. FBI Miami was not aware of this. And at that time, working through Legat Rome, who was providing all of this intelligence and information coming from the INP to FBI Miami, our organized crime squad. So this was, again, a high-profile target right in our backyard that no one was aware of. Me being new to the squad, even though I was an experienced agent, I didn't have anything that I was working at that time. It was just a timing thing. So my supervisor, Joe Cicini, who I mentioned in the book many times, he was a friend of mine. He gave me this investigation. It was my lead to start. So I started it from the very beginning. So that's how I came to work this investigation. So that's why I was basically given the target, which was Settineri with no informant. Obviously, good mafia informants, they don't grow on trees, needless to say. Eventually, I was able to develop a couple, but it was a painstaking and very time-consuming process. But once I did have a couple of sources in place, I was able to determine that Settineri was involved in your typical run-of-the-mill mafia-style activities in the Miami area. I noticed right away he was developing a stronghold on a couple of boiler rooms. Boiler rooms, for those of you who aren't familiar, they're basically businesses where high pressure and sometimes illegal or unethical sales tactics are used. Settineri was involved in several of these in the greater Miami area and Broward County as well. He was receiving kickbacks from these owners. He was pressuring the owners to give him money for his so-called assistance. And we also believed that Settineri was extorting businesses. Settineri's favorite hangout in Miami Beach was an Italian restaurant on Lincoln Road. Believe it or not, the restaurant was called Soprano Cafe, ironically enough. A very well-known Italian restaurant in a ritzy area of Miami Beach. Of the literally hundreds of times that I was out on surveillance there at the Soprano Cafe, I saw Settineri receive cash payments in white envelopes from the owner several times.
Other than him going there on a frequent basis, was it a hangout for organized crime?
It was. This was really, I called it his office because he was there almost every day. And he claimed to people that he was part owner of the restaurant, but we were never able to confirm that. I think that he was just extorting the restaurant, used it as his little office area, conduct his meetings there with his business associates, mafia partners. So we got to know the place quite well.
How blatant to be frequenting a cafe that's called the Soprano Cafe, a restaurant. Yeah.
I know. You can't make it up. It was really funny. And remember, this was 2006, 7, and 8. So at that time, Sopranos, the show was, I think it was still going on at that time. I know it wasn't too far from that. Settineri would come to the Soprano Cafe and he would walk back to the kitchen and get his own food. I mean, he would stand at the counter and the cook would hand him his food and he'd go sit down. He wouldn't pay his bill, but they paid him. So it wasn't hard to figure out that he was being provided payments for whatever business he was doing with them, which I think was extortion. So the sources that we had in place were reporting on these type of activities of Settineri over a period of several months. However, I believe that Settineri was involved in much more egregious type criminal activity. And the sources that I had in place, they didn't have the relationship with Settineri or honestly the ability to go to that next level and witness any other types of these serious criminal activities that we suspected him to be involved with. Eventually, I realized that I needed to try to insert an FBI undercover agent into the investigation, one who would be more skilled at dealing with someone as sophisticated as Mr. Settineri. But Jerry, as you know, using an undercover FBI agent, this is difficult, time-consuming, and it can be very risky. Also, there are lots of hurdles due to the extensive FBI approvals that are required to be obtained before you can conduct this type of activity. Needless to say, it's not an easy process. At this time, we had the source in place. At this point, when we're requesting the undercover investigation, this is probably 6 or 8 months into the investigation. So by this time, we do have a couple of informants, but they just weren't real bad guys who could get that close to determine the more serious criminal activity that we were certain was being conducted by Settineri. So after a few months, after we had the approval in hand, of course, we were eventually able to get an FBI undercover agent introduced to Settineri. Over much time, over much planning and preparation, this FBI undercover agent was able to gain the trust of Settineri. The undercover agent was portraying to be a Colombian cartel money launderer. Remember, this is Miami, so it's not a stretch. That would be the role we would choose. There were a lot of those running around in Miami. After some time, when trust was developed between the two, the undercover agent was able to engage in a series of private meetings with Settineri. And in those recorded meetings, Settineri, by now, he's completely comfortable with the undercover agent. He began to reveal his criminal past back when he was in Italy. He discussed prior drug deals he was involved with, money laundering operations he had been involved with. This was the type of activity that we suspected Settineri being involved with. So now we were rolling. And soon, in one meeting, Settineri even agreed to launder money for our FBI undercover. Remember, he thinks he's a cartel member, so he thinks the undercover agent's a fellow bad guy, and he's wanting to get into business with our undercover agent, which is our objective. Now, this was a significant moment in the investigation. This is when it kind of rose to the next level, so to speak. We now had Settineri asking our undercover agent to commit criminal activity with him. We were now prepared to go through with the money laundering deals with Settineri, which would be actual physical evidence for us. And then he drops a bombshell on the undercover agent. Settineri asks our undercover agent if he has the ability to obtain black market weapons for Settineri's organization. Certainly, this was a huge moment in the case.
Ooh, escalation.
That's exactly right. Settineri advised that these weapons, they will be imported into Italy and then elsewhere into Europe or Africa. So, as we said, obviously, this is a big break in the investigation. And by this time, the case had already attracted a lot of attention from the FBI brass. After this moment, you can imagine that attention, the scrutiny from the bosses, it escalated along with the quality in the investigation. At this point, I was briefing my ASAC and my FBI headquarters folks several times a week. ASAC, that's my assistant special agent in charge. So now we had our work cut out for us.
Yeah, whenever you have a situation where there could be a nexus to terrorism, especially in these days and times in the FBI, then yeah, it escalates very quickly, very fast.
It sure does. It sure does. And now we had our work cut out for us. We had Settineri now agreeing to launder money for our undercover agent, and now he wants black market weapons. So we are moving along well. Now we're getting all the attention from the FBI brass. We're doing well. All we had to do now was set up the specifics with Settineri, the terms, get the overt act, the money changing hands, and now we would have real evidence to charge him with. At this point, that's the planning that we're doing. A few days later, when the time came for a follow-up meeting between the undercover agent and Settineri, our undercover agent, he calls Settineri over the telephone. He doesn't answer. So the undercover leaves him a voicemail. He says, hey, call me back. Let's set up that meeting that we talked about the other day. Now, at that time, we had a court order approval to listen in on Settineri's phone conversation, what's called a Title III. Most of you probably know the Title III, that's the wiretap act that gives you the judicial authority to intercept and record phone calls of suspected individuals. Not long after our undercover agent left this message for Settineri, I received a call from our Title III room, and that's the place where our fellow FBI agents are monitoring Settineri's calls for us. They told me, hey, come down to the Title III room. There's an important call that we think you need to listen to. This was a common occurrence. It happened all the time. The Title III guys, they would call me and say, hey, we think there's an important call you might want to hear, you might want to listen to right away. It might help you in what you're doing right now. So I really wasn't alarmed at the moment. That was until I actually listened to that call. That's to Settineri's call. The call that the Title III folks called me about was Settineri talking to a fellow mob associate. Now, this guy he was speaking with, he was an older mentor type to Settineri. So in the call, Settineri tells him that he thinks one of the guys he's been dealing with, and he's talking about our undercover agent, he thinks one of the guys he's been dealing with, he believes he's a cop. So Settineri doesn't give a reason why he thinks this. He just says that something doesn't feel right to him. And in the call, the associate tells him, hey, if you feel that way, walk away. Your instincts have always served you well, Roberto. And that was exactly what Settineri did. He completely walked away from our undercover agent forever. He never called him again. So as you can imagine, I was devastated. Everyone involved in the case was devastated. The undercover agent, the investigative team, all the work, time and effort, resources seemingly down the drain at that moment in time. So that was a very difficult time for us.
I would imagine that there's big concern too, because Settineri was the one who brought up the buying of the firearms. And now that he's not using the undercover agent, is he using someone else to do this?
Exactly. And no, your thinking is right on. And that's what we did. What went wrong? At this moment in time, there was a lot of self-reflection. What went wrong? We didn't know. We racked our brains for days over this. We listened to the previous recorded meetings with Settineri over and over again, hoping to pick up on what maybe tipped him off. We never found out for sure. I guess he just had good gut instinct. I mean, who knows why? At this time, there wasn't a lot of time to dwell on our missteps. The question now was, what do we do now? With Settineri now spooked, our options with him, they were limited. We couldn't make a run at him again, at least not for a while. I decided we should, for the time being, divert our focus over to Tricamo, Antonio Tricamo, his right-hand man. He was vulnerable. Maybe we could dirty him up, Tricamo that is, and try to flip him to cooperate against Settineri. I felt it was our best option at this point. It was really our only option. And at this time, with all of the FBI management and headquarters scrutiny, it was wearing down on me with all of the potential in the investigation, the big expectations. And now with this latest setback, I was stressed, as you can imagine. Because, Jerry, you know this, sometimes if you aren't making progress in your case or you hit a dead end, especially when you are conducting undercover operations and Title IIIs and things like that, if you're not making progress, FBI management, they'll say, hey, listen, we're going to shut down your case. There was a lot of pressure. So now Tricamo, he was our focus. And to keep the case alive, we needed to come up with a good plan of approach. We knew he was greedy. We knew he was not as bright as Settineri. We played right into that greed. That was the plan. Our intel had told us that Tricamo, he was always looking to make a quick buck, just like any other self-respecting mobster, I guess. Legitimate money or not, it didn't matter to him. He was a risk taker. He did what he had to do to make money. Our plan was we dangled a new undercover FBI agent, different undercover FBI agent. We dangled him right under his nose. One who was portraying another drug dealer and money launderer type. You know, it's Miami, remember? So that type of character, it's always a safe choice to settle on when you're working undercover operations in Miami. Fortunately for us, that dangle worked. It didn't take long at all. And soon, Tricamo, he was helping our FBI undercover agent launder millions of dollars of what he thought was drug proceeds. Meanwhile, we're racking up big federal charges on Tricamo as a result. This is all good stuff, right?
You have to explain to everyone if the FBI is actually giving him millions of dollars. Where's this money coming from? Where is it going?
Yeah, good question, too. We don't actually give money to the bad guys and let them control it. We devised a scenario that our FBI undercover agents was controlling. Tricamo believed that our FBI undercover agent was a drug trafficker who needed help laundering money. So, in a controlled situation, we would give Tricamo, at that time, we were giving him $250,000 at a time of cash. Of course, this is FBI money that we obtained through approvals from headquarters, from our headquarters folks. The undercover agent would give Tricamo directions. Here's this money. We need you to transport it from point A to point B so that we can get this money laundered. We can get this money back into our hands so that we could spend it. That's exactly what Tricamo did. And those money laundering operations, again, tightly controlled. We had surveillance out. We even had our SOG helicopters out patrolling to making sure, monitoring that Tricamo was going where he was supposed to be. And if he didn't, obviously we would take him down because the Bureau is not in the business of losing that kind of money. So we did it in $250,000 increments. So we did 4 to 5 of those, which gave us our $1 million threshold amount. We were moving right along with Tricamo, which, like I said, was all good stuff. But remember, Settineri, he was the main target in the case. The overall objective of the investigation had been we wanted to jam up Settineri with the big federal charges. He was the big fish with the large criminal network. We wanted to get him to flip and expose his organization, all the high-level mob guys, the VIPs, the big shots that Settineri knew. But now we found ourselves down to the level of Tricamo. Nonetheless, we soon had a big hammer over Tricamo's head, basically with the money laundering charges.
So what was the plan?
Good question. At this point, we had the money laundering. We had also evidence of Tricamo trafficking in counterfeit cigarettes, which is a big federal hit. So we had heavy federal charges. So, like you're saying, the question now was, how long should we continue the undercover operation with Tricamo? Eventually, we had to approach him with this hammer that we have, right, with all of this evidence, and try to get him to cooperate against his boss, which was the overall plan at this point. But the more pressing question is, if and when we do that, when Tricamo was faced with these big federal charges, and he was looking at about 10 years in prison, basically, at this point, when he's presented with that, would he agree to cooperate against Settineri? Or would he just take the hit, not give up anyone, and just do his time in a federal penitentiary? And Jerry, as you know, you go through this at this point in any case you're working. You have to do a analysis. Do we really think this guy will cooperate? These are mafia people, so a lot of times they have no intention. They'll just rot in jail. This was heavy on our minds at this point in time, and this was going on for a couple months. And then it was about this time in the case when, out of the blue, I received a call from the U.S. Attorney's Office. So thinking back what we've been discussing here, do you remember Settineri's many celebrity and VIP contacts in Miami that we spoke of earlier?
Yeah, definitely. He knew a lot of people.
He knew a lot of people, a lot of celebrities, not to mention high-level mob people, a lot of drug dealers, you name it. He knew everyone, it seemed. Well, one of these people, a flashy, well-known South Florida attorney, Jerry, this is a person you probably remember, a guy by the name of Scott Rothstein. had just turned himself into the U.S. Attorney's Office in Fort Lauderdale.
Yes, I definitely remember him because I did a case review with one of your Miami colleagues, retired agent Richard Stout, episode 275, all about Scott Rothstein.
Exactly. And Rothstein could certainly fill up an entire episode, that is for sure. So at this point, this is 2009, Rothstein turns himself into the U.S. Attorney's Office, confesses to being the mastermind behind the $1.2 million Ponzi scheme that your show with my good friend Rich Stout you discussed a while back. The $1.2 billion Ponzi scheme was about to go belly up. Rothstein comes in from the cold, as I like to call it, talks to the U.S. Attorney's Office, confesses, and says, what can I do to make this right? Based on his $1.2 billion Ponzi scheme, and it was right out of the classic Ponzi scheme playbook. Now he wanted to cooperate any way he could to help himself out. Well, what did this mean for the Paesan Blues investigation? Early in the investigation, I knew that Settineri had telephonic contact with Scott Rothstein, and I knew who Scott Rothstein was from the very beginning, and I knew Rothstein was a big player. But as we discussed, there were many high-level people, celebrities, VIPs, criminals that he was in telephonic contact with. So this was the biggest break of all in the case, because Rothstein had agreed to cooperate with the government because he was looking at 100 years in prison for his fraudulent activities. I had Rothstein working as a cooperator in my case, willing to help any way that he could, and help he did. Soon, due to his prior relationship with Settineri, remember, they already knew each other very well. We had Rothstein meeting with Settineri face-to-face in recorded meetings. And in a quickly devised scenario, we had Mr. Rothstein ask Settineri, at our direction, of course, to help Rothstein launder money and destroy some legal documents. Money and legal documents, he told Settineri, that he wanted to conceal from the federal authorities due to his recent legal problems from the Ponzi scheme. By the way, this was all over the news, nationwide, not to mention in South Florida. This was on the news nonstop for weeks at a time about Rothstein's Ponzi scheme. Because remember, Rothstein was a very well-known, somewhat of a celebrity attorney in South Florida.
I know he had a lot of political connections too. My question then is, if this is well known, it's in all the newspapers, why would anybody want to speak with him or trust him? And how are you going to use his cooperation?
Great question. And my gosh, at the time when this happened, I was very happy to have Rothstein working as a cooperator in the investigation because of the status that our case was at that point in time. But I didn't believe it would work because what you're talking about, Jerry, this is all over the news. So what bad guy, what criminal is going to have anything to do with Rothstein when he knows that he's being investigated by the FBI and the IRS and every other federal agency because of this Ponzi scheme? What are the odds of him having anything to do with our cooperator? I didn't think it was very good at all, but I have to tell you, Scott Rothstein did a very good job. And with the scenario that we came up for him, he sold it so well. Here's what happened. After a few meetings, ironing out the details, Settineri agreed to assist Rothstein. He told him, listen, you're a good friend. I'll help you out. I know you're in trouble. I'll help you conceal your money, which we had told Settineri that Rothstein had $10 million that he needed to clean. We also instructed Rothstein to tell Settineri that he had these legal documents that were damning to his federal case, and he needed someone to go get them out of a storage unit and destroy them for him. So Settineri agreed, but he agreed to assist Rothstein for a negotiated fee of $1 million. That was the plan, at least set in Settineri's mind.
So he wasn't doing this out of the kindness of his heart. A good friend. Mm.
That's exactly right. He wasn't doing it because he was a loyal friend, which is what he's told Rothstein. But hey, I'll help you out, buddy. But I want $1 million of that $10 million, which played right into our hands because that's exactly what we thought would happen. To actually go through with the scenario, we gave Rothstein $70,000 in a test run. And that's generally what you do in money laundering operations. You don't just give the entire amount, right? You do a test run. You want to prove that each side can live up to their agreement. Settineri laundered the $70,000 in a test run at the instructions of Rothstein, coming from us, of course, from the FBI, into an FBI undercover account. And Rothstein gave Settineri directions to the location of these bogus legal documents, which he thought were real legal documents. And Settineri went out and obtained these documents for Rothstein and destroyed the documents using a paper shredder and burnt them, I think, at some point. That was all that we needed for destruction of evidence charges and for the conspiracy to launder millions of dollars. You don't really actually need him to launder the entire amount to obtain the criminal conspiracy charges of the full amount of the $10 million. In the book, I get into a lot of the detail concerning the cooperation of Rothstein, which is what, Jerry, you were alluding to, and how amazing of a performance it was by him when you consider the fact that Settineri knew that Rothstein was being investigated by the FBI, and he still agreed to commit these crimes for Rothstein. It was because Settineri, his greed finally caught up to him. That $1 million sounded pretty good. He'll take his chances and his luck run out this time.
$1 million is an incentive for some people. I've never been offered, but hopefully I know better.
That's right. Yeah, that's a lot of money. So now at this point, we finally had real evidence on Settineri. And in March of 2010, we arrested Settineri and Tricamo, along with two other low-level associates who helped Settineri with the money laundering and the destruction of evidence. Settineri nor Tricamo, either one, they never did cooperate with the FBI. They never gave up any of their fellow mobsters or criminal associates. In the book, I go into some detail as to why I think that they didn't cooperate. For that matter, in the book, there's a lot of other interesting detail concerning the entire 3+ year investigation that I hope people will find interesting.
One of the things that I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about, and that is your collaboration with the Italian National Police, the INP. Them contacting the FBI is what initiated this case. Did they play a role, or did you continue to interact with them during this 3.5 year investigation?
We sure did. We sure did. I developed close association with the INP, specifically with an individual by the name of Roberto D'Annunzio, who was an INP officer. Throughout the entire investigation, we were constantly comparing notes. And at this time, when we were investigating Settineri, the INP was investigating several of Settineri's associates in Italy and Sicily. So when we arrested Settineri and Tricamo here, we conducted a joint arrest with the INP, and they arrested several, actually it was up to 20 people the INP arrested in Italy at the same time. But throughout the investigation, I actually made a couple of trips to Italy and visited the INP and Italian authorities and briefed them on the Settineri investigation, because Settineri was an important, very important person to them. So we shared information throughout. And individuals of the INP on several occasions actually came to Miami. We hosted them here several times for briefings and update of the investigation, and actually took them around and showed them where Settineri was living, where he was operating, and whatnot. We had close and very good contact and a relationship with the INP. As for the results of the investigation, Settineri and his two underling associates, they were charged with one count of conspiracy to commit money laundering in an amount of $10 million and one count of obstruction of justice. Settineri ultimately pled guilty. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. He actually served 30 months, and he was let out several years ago on good behavior. His associates also pled guilty to obstruction of justice, and they were sentenced to 10 months in jail. Now, Tricamo was charged with 4 counts of money laundering, 6 counts of trafficking in contraband. There was those counterfeit cigarettes we discussed, 250,000 counterfeit cigarettes. He pled guilty to 1 charge of money laundering. All of the other charges were dropped, and he served 18 months in jail. After his release from prison, he was deported back to Italy.
Now, in your book, you also list 1 count of marriage fraud. So I was very curious about that. So what's up with that?
Yeah, that was interesting. And that's a good pickup on your part. When we were going through the charges on Tricamo, we actually did another background check and had more analysis be conducted of Tricamo and what he was doing. And one of our fantastic FBI analysts discovered that Tricamo was involved in some marriage fraud, and we were able to prove it. So we used it as a hammer against him. So he had a lot going on. He was charged with the 4 counts of money laundering, the trafficking of 250,000 counterfeit cigarettes, and then with the marriage fraud. That marriage fraud was instrumental in being able to have him deported back to Italy after his 18 months in jail. Yeah, that was interesting. There was so much involved in this investigation and so many side stories.
But what was it? I mean, I know what marriage fraud is, but do you have any specifics about he claimed to be married to somebody, but you found out he wasn't living there? Or what's the details on that? Do you remember?
Yeah, and I don't remember specifics. I think it had something to do with him agreeing to being married, so in order so he could stay in the U.S. to keep his legal status, or something to that effect. And that was something we discovered late in the investigation. It was just one of those charges we were able to tack on. But it was true. He was a part of some marriage fraud scam. There's a lot of that goes on in Miami, so no big surprise.
Well, this is fantastic, but I know that there are going to be some people who are wondering about what happened in this situation because you initially went after everyone because they were involved in illegal boiler rooms, but they're now being charged with something that some people would think, well, the FBI set that up. Could you explain to them about predication and why during your undercover investigation you can put out feelers to see if they are interested in committing illegal activity?
That's another good question, too, with predication. And as you know, Jerry, in the FBI, we take predication very seriously. And throughout my entire career, I've been the type of person that if there's no predication, even though we have information of criminal activity by someone, I take the predication very seriously because a lot of times, as I like to say, our job is to vindicate people. And I have done that before many times and just walked away from an investigation because of that. But with this case, predication was certainly there. We had many times when I directed the undercover agents to discuss these types of criminal activity with Settineri, we always gave them an out. We would say, hey, listen, you realize, and same thing with Tricamo, especially Tricamo, we told them, listen, this is criminal activity, not in those exact words, but say, hey, this is illegal and we could go to jail for this. Are you willing to take that risk? Are you okay? And they always did. They were more than happy to be involved with criminal activity. We always clear those hurdles, and it's a high hurdle to make sure we're investigating people who are actually criminals. I wouldn't waste time with anything just to target someone who wasn't really involved with any criminal activity. So that is always a very challenging thing for us. And the FBI was to establish that the activity that these people were involved with, that they were criminals, and always give them an out. And Settineri was certainly involved in many criminal enterprises. You mentioned the boiler rooms. He was also involved in, he was so many things he was involved with that I didn't mention today that I briefly discuss in the book, involved in stolen merchandise. He was also, at one point, I think he was arrested in Miami Beach for waving a gun at some poor security guard who he got ticked off. So Settineri was also known to be physical and beat people up and threaten people. He was involved in a lot of things, but the areas that we targeted were the more egregious activity, drug trafficking, money laundering, and the weapons trafficking. But no, good question. That's always something that we like to discuss. And then, of course, you know the rest of Mr. Rothstein. After his cooperation, he cooperated in many other investigations, and ultimately he was sentenced to 50 years in federal prison.
For those who don't understand, okay, he cooperated. How is it that he gets 50 years? You'll have to explain that. Now, of course, I want everybody to go back and listen to episode 275 with Rich Stout. But to save them a little time, explain why he still got 50 years if he cooperated on all of these investigations.
Yeah, no, good question. And yeah, please have your listeners go back and listen to episode 275 with Rich Stout. That's a fascinating story with Scott Rothstein. But remember, Rothstein was looking at 100 years because of his massive fraud. So that's a lot of time to have to work off. He was working, juggling several investigations when he was working mine. I think he was working a public corruption investigation and several other investigations. I was aware of them at the time, but I was really focused on what I was doing. Some of those other investigations that he worked with the government, the U.S. Attorney's Office discovered that he lied. He gave false information during his cooperation. When that happens, you immediately lose all of your credit for helping the government if you lied in anything that you were doing. And that's exactly what happened to Rothstein. So, to your very good question, that was why he ended up still having to do a lot of time. Mr. Rothstein was still involved in a lot of trouble after that. So that's why he had to do his 50 years. But yeah, hopefully your listeners will go back and listen to that with Rothstein as well. Fascinating investigation. Interesting guy, too.
Well, this was a fascinating case review. So I do know that the United States Attorney's Office in the Southern District of Miami honored you and your entire team with an Outstanding Law Enforcement Officer of the Year award for your work on this Paesan Blues investigation. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I really appreciate the opportunity to come out and discuss this investigation.
Now, I know you hinted here a little bit about some issues that you had, some things that could have derailed the case. And I can tell everyone who is going to have the opportunity to read your book that you talk a lot about that. Were those setbacks part of your motivation to write your book?
It was something that I thought was important to discuss. Basically, with a lot of the negative news that you see the Bureau involved with these days, unfortunately, some of the missteps. But in this book, I don't really get into the politics per se. It's more of politics of internally that I discuss how the Bureau's culture was changing at the time. And really, as a result of several policies that were being implemented at that time that just seemed to change things within the Bureau. At the time, I didn't know what was going on, obviously, but I did notice that things were changing and some of the problems that I had trying to work the investigation didn't make sense at the time. But now that you reflect on some of these policies that changed the Bureau, I understand how that happened. As you can tell, Jerry, reading the book, I'm not bashing the Bureau. It's more matter of fact from the viewpoint of an FBI agent working investigations, my experience in dealing with some of those things.
I would like to be a little bit clearer for listeners. So basically, a lot of the issues had to do with the management and their maybe inexperience, or maybe you could call it their motivation for making certain decisions that weren't necessarily good for the case.
You definitely read the book. Thank you for pointing that out. That is a very good point. Yes. And that was, in addition to the policy changes at the time and the so-called culture, because of that culture change, it resulted in having a couple of managers that probably weren't qualified to be doing those positions. As a result, like you're saying, you saw decisions being made not for the good of the investigation, not for the good of the FBI, but more for the furthering of their career, unfortunately. That was my experience with it. And the book, I talk about how I overcome a lot of those obstacles, which makes just for more interesting reading and it made for a more challenging investigation. But your initial question was, I knew all along, even back when I was working the investigation, I had so many people jokingly tell me, God, you got to write a book about this when this is over. I never took it seriously at the time, but when the opportunity came up for me to write a book about the investigation, I just thought that it might be an opportunity to throw some of those observations regarding the Bureau's changes in as well, just for more interesting reading.
I should also remark that you use the true name of several people in your book, and many of them who have been on this podcast, such as my good friend Jack Garcia. But when it comes to other people, you don't use their true name.
Yeah, as you'll see, there's probably the majority of them I do use true name who were involved and helped me with the case, or I mentioned people like Rich Stout, Jack Garcia, who are great friends of mine and people that I worked with over the years. Jack Garcia, as we know, is probably, well, he is one of the best FBI undercover agents in Bureau history. And Jack and I actually worked investigations together. Early in my career, I learned so much from him on how to operate undercover operations. So a lot of people I do mention by their true name who helped in the investigation, and they, of course, got their permission. There are a couple who didn't really help a lot and actually were obstacles that I used different names for just to protect their identity out of respect for them. I thought that was the right way to handle it.
Well, again, the name of your book is Mafia Miami, FBI Politics and How an Investigation Was Nearly Sabotaged. The book is officially going to be released on March 5th, but for those listening, it is available for pre-order right now. I will have a link in the show notes for this episode for you to go and pick up your copy. And it's also available on your publisher's website.
Yes, it sure is. It's advertised on the Roman and Littlefield website for early order. Roman and Littlefield, that's roman.com.
Congratulations. A lot of people say they want to write a book and they never do, but you did.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Now we're at the point of the interview where I like to go back in time a little bit and ask you why and when you joined the FBI.
I was always interested in law enforcement. I enlisted in the United States Air Force out of high school and was in a security police unit. So I was always interested in the law enforcement profession. And even if you talk to my mother, she has a picture of me and when I was about 4 years old, and I'm wearing a fedora with a little jacket and a little play gun right out of Hawaii Five-0 or something, I guess. But I just always had that interest in law enforcement. So the obvious career call for me was to try to be good enough to work for the FBI in the ultimate law enforcement capacity. And I was very fortunate to be accepted into that organization.
Once you were in the Bureau, I know that you were in San Francisco and then you went to Miami where you worked OC. And then after this case, the Paesan Blue investigation, you moved to public corruption?
I did. After about 5 or 6 years working organized crime, I moved to a public corruption squad and worked there for several years. In South Florida, Miami area, there's a lot of activity in the public corruption realm that keeps you busy. So it was just a challenging opportunity and was able to work with a lot of good friends of mine who were in that unit. That was just something that I was interested in doing. And as you know, Jerry, with the FBI, that's one of the many wonderful things about it was you're able to move around and work different squads, as we call them, different violations. So if you get bored doing public corruption, you can move to terrorism or you can move to white collar. That was just one of those opportunities that I took advantage of.
When did you retire and what are you doing now?
I retired in 2018. Currently, I'm working for the National Football League and their security unit. I'm an integrity representative for them. I've been doing that for a couple of years. I also do some other private security consulting type contracting activities. I've been primarily most of my time working with the NFL for the last couple of years.
We're at the end of the interview, and I like to give my guests the last word. So what would you like to say?
First of all, I'd like to say thank you for the opportunity to speak before your audience. And something you mentioned a little while ago, you said a lot of people talk about writing a book and actually did it. And that is true. If I can write a book, anyone can write a book. So I would just say for those of you out there who have an interest in expressing your thoughts or you have a great story to tell, I know it seems like a daunting experience or difficult obstacle-ridden thing to do, but if you've had the desire, give it a shot. It's well worth it.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a headshot and bio for Jerry Hester, links to articles about the Paesan Blue investigation and case-related photos, and of course, there's a link to where you can purchase his new true crime book, Mafia Miami, FBI Politics and How an Investigation Was Nearly Sabotaged, as well as links to FBI Retired Case File Review episode 275 with retired agent Rich Stout reviewing his investigation of Scott Rothstein. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.